It's a great pleasure for me to be here with Nick Spitzer today and have a conversation about jazz in World War II and beyond. Let me just say a few things about Nick. Nick is professor of anthropology at Tulane University, but I would imagine many of you know him for his role in hosting American Roots, really a path-breaking program that's been on public radio for 22 years now and is broadcast in some 340 stations around the country. If you haven't listened to Nick and American Roots, I'm not sure what you're really doing with your time, because you're really missing out on something special. Nick has a list of publications that is far too long for me to read out here, but he has a background in folklore and community and culture, those ties here in the Gulf South, and just many other publications that we could not mention here for time. But Nick, it's great to have you here. So thanks for taking out the time to talk with us this morning on the topic of jazz in World War II and beyond. Before we start our discussion, I do want to acknowledge my colleague in the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, Rebecca Poole. It was actually her idea to take this topic on and really got the ball rolling in the Institute. And she wrote a fantastic article about Dave Bartholomew, which Nick and I will be talking about here shortly. So I want to thank Rebecca for the great idea and then what's come about from it since. So with that, Nick, why don't we get started? This is a huge topic. There is so much to say about it, and we're in the perfect place. You're uptown, I'm in mid-city, here in the great city of New Orleans, where so much of this history really got started. But before we kind of open up the huge subject of jazz in the Second World War, maybe we should start out by just talking about the issue of music and war in a broader sense. And I know this is something that's interested you. It has a long history prior to World War II, prior to jazz, about the relationship between music making and war.
Well, I mean, I think at least to the Middle Ages, you can look at things where people are using music to, encourage the troops to charge, or to make the enemy scared, putting up fireworks and having performances in the background behind troops. And I think most Americans think of, the William Tell Overture, which is itself kind of based on the idea of the clarion call of the bugle. Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders gets us to beginning of the 20th century. So there's that call to arms and intimidation factor. But I think a lot of what we're see and hear from World War II and after is music as something that gives comfort and helps people celebrate their humanity, addresses sorrow, but also brings joy, encourages people on the home front to take care of the war effort by rationing or fundraising, and it gives people a break. But there still are all the martial things that music does, on the front and behind it for, playing the anthem, playing patriotic songs, and those kinds of things as well that kind of go with the martial side of war. But it is a huge topic, and yet at the same time, in the middle of this chaos and the discipline required for war, some incredible creativity is found in musicians in World War II, especially around jazz. So that's I guess what got us here together in the room today.
It is. It's obviously a topic that is of great interest to both of us, and there's so much complexity to it. It operates on so many levels because jazz, for many people outside of the United States, jazz represented America. For many people, it was something kind of fundamentally American about it, and obviously that music, in turn, really, I think, pushed Americans to think about their society, about their democracy, especially during and after World War II. And I know some of that we're going to get into today, but I think where I'd like to start, Nick, is just a couple of questions about this issue of jazz and Americanness, if we can just say that, right? And that for a lot of Americans, right, jazz was democratic. It was the embodiment of democracy. And could you say something about that? Like how a lot of the musicians and a lot of the fans of that music, they saw something inherently democratic about it.
Well, in the jazz age, the 20s, music that was beginning in New Orleans and ends up in Chicago and New York, little by little spreads to London, Paris, Shanghai. I mean, there were jazz bands in Shanghai. In fact, there were Black American bands in Shanghai during the war, during the Japanese attacks, and hiding out in the French sector where they couldn't be bombed. But so there's the jazz age, and then by the 30s, during the Depression, what happens is you get a music industry that consolidates jazz, and swing sort of becomes like the rock and roll or pop music of the era. And swing has an undercurrent of African American style, but it goes wide into white audiences. And so swing becomes a way that people dance and socialize, and they're swinging, you know? And it's made not as much of an improvisation kind of music. It's usually written down arrangements, but the dancers get to improvise in their lives with that music as a backdrop. So by the time we get to World War II, you know, you have somebody like, you know, Glenn Miller, who spent time both with Army side of life and also the Air Force, and he becomes quite famous for basically volunteering to go in and be involved in creating all kinds of swing dance occasions, you know, in the media and on base and near the front and all that. So right there, you're seeing the popular music of the day really overwhelmingly associated with that scene, the jazz swing movement.
You know, that's interesting. What you're pointing to is that for many people, especially from its early days, that kind of chaotic or kind of semi-chaotic improvisational character of jazz was what drew many people to it. That it was very creative. It required you to kind of think on your feet, really, you know, musically, and you know, that ability to kind of innovate on the spot was very exciting. But you're pointing out that the reality was by the 30s is that there was a lot of commercialization had set in. There was a lot of standardization, 3-4 minute kind of pop kind of tunes that were coming out. Yet at the level of dance, there still was a side of it that still had some of that improvisational character preserved in it. And that'll be interesting to see in the war, you know, how World War II really, the issue about what to do with the swing era and how to relate to that music and the commercialization that had come out of that decade. And I hope we can get into some of that when we talk about some individual musicians. But what I'd like to sort of ask then next, Nick, is the flip side of that. Like if many Americans took pride in jazz as something democratic, even as you noted, it came out of the roots of African-American culture in the South, a deeply segregated South. It still had this kind of aura of democracy and freedom and creativity to it. And in fact, those aspects are some of the main reasons why Hitler and the Nazi regime absolutely despised jazz, right? So could you say something, Nick, about the kind of fervent, like anti-jazz propaganda you see in the Nazi regime in the 30s and 40s?
Yeah, well, I mean, Goebbels said jazz was subhuman. You know, by the time, the landings of Italy, apparently the word jazz was actually banned. There was a minority of German youth that were into the swing thing, you know, because they were into a global context, and some of them were having underground swing dance parties. But generally speaking, certainly the Nazi regime was, you know, white supremacist regime, and jazz was all about black people and later Jewish people commingling with, you know, good old white American Protestants and mixing and mingling and creating this new music in a democratic society. So it was antithetical to an authoritarian vision of white nationalism and culture. And some of the music made by the Nazis as a kind of I guess a counteroffensive, you could say, was overtly anti-Semitic. I mean, and you know, attacked Jews with popular tunes that, you know, jazz musicians had made. So they went that far. That means they were taking that seriously, that they knew that music was giving comfort to a lot of people. And they were trying to, you know, rally the side, you know, towards authoritarianism. And of course, it was an abysmal artistic failure. And you can't stop jazz, the way it spread around the world and the way it goes into the military. I mean, whether you know, bring in recruits for Glenn Miller's band, or you just have guys joining the service like Dave Bartholomew, John Coltrane, or others. You know, there's this enormous well of talent among the American soldiers that little by little become performers for their fellow troops and ultimately have incredible careers after the war based on what they learned while they were there going global. Because the war was a democratic effort. Everybody participated. And while there was segregation, There still was also a lot of, country people met city people. People from the South met people from the North. Different ethnicities mixed and mingled, in many cases. And as far as, the African-American sources, no question. Jazz doesn't begin in Africa. It begins in America, but it's dominantly African-Americans essentially taking some of the post-Civil War march material in New Orleans and turning it in. They're jazzing up marches, they're jazzing up hymns, they're jazzing up pop music. So it moves forward as in that. And at the height of Jim Crow, jazz develops as a counterpoint to white nationalism in America. So there's that power behind it. I'll just say one other thing. Ralph Ellison once, when asked about the lack of protection for African-American rights ultimately and how the Constitution and Bill of Rights was implemented, he said, "Oh, but we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. It's called jazz." And he was basically saying, with our intelligence and creativity, we've made this new music that Americans and the world love. And it speaks to individualism, improvisation, but also sharing in the dance, sharing in the familiarity. And I think in World War II, both those things are going on. You're having fabulous improvisers who are, working off something and creating something new, but you also have people playing familiar tunes and things that everyone shares and calling it all jazz.
I think it's very important really for our audience to think about how jazz, it was so much more than just music, for people at that time. And you noted obviously this kind of hatred that Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and others had for jazz because, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman, right? Black and Jewish musicians who were out front, who were representative of this type of music, which they saw as a simple race mixing, which they despised, they hated as these kind of this fanatical kind of racist vision of purity. They saw jazz as absolutely antithetical, and in many ways it really was antithetical, to that. But you're also pointing out that jazz had a critical place in American life too. It will kind of shine the light back on the U.S. about living up to promises of democracy. About promises of freedom and equality. And the Second World War will certainly bring those, to the forefront. If this is a struggle against fascism, as viciously racist a movement as you're ever going to see, then what's that going to mean for a society where Jim Crow is still around, where there are other forms, where patriarchy, et cetera. There's all kinds of forms of anti-democratic, perspectives, institutions, ideas are still there. And I think that's a good place, maybe, Nick, to talk about some of the musicians who are serving in World War II in the American Armed Forces and how that really does affect their music. And what better place to start than in the city of New Orleans, right, with the great Dave Bartholomew. Why don't we start with him and talk about, about his kind of arc really through War II and the immediate post-war years?
Well, Dave Bartholomew grew up in a small town upriver, Edgard, Louisiana, Creole-speaking town, came to New Orleans as a youth with his father, who was a barber. There were musicians in his family. I've interviewed Dave 3 times. He passed away at a little over 100 years, not too long ago. And he certainly, in some ways, he's a jazz architect, but also an architect of rhythm and blues and rock and roll. And he, in 1942, he is drafted into the 196th Ground Force. And, he goes into the Army and is essentially, not somebody that knows how to do arrangements, to score music and those kinds of things. But now he's interacting with people from New York City and Los Angeles and everywhere else. And he had been playing on riverboats, playing New Orleans traditional jazz, with a lot of the great jazz band leaders in the city, the parade bands. And he really was very much an adherent of classic New Orleans traditional jazz. But now he's hearing swing. There's elements, believe it or not, by the late 30s and into the early 40s of bebop, where there's all this improvisation starting and a new generation of people who've been a bit more schooled and trying out new things. And so the Army gives him that chance to become a serious band leader over a group of people who are not New Orleans riverboat jazz players, but are coming from all these backgrounds. So by the time he gets back to New Orleans, he becomes a band leader, an arranger, ultimately a record producer, and really, in some ways, gets us to the New Orleans R&B sound. And it's an interesting and complicated reality. He never was known as a great popular performer himself, even though he was a brilliant trumpet player. But he had a couple songs, and there's one we could play if you'd like to give a hear to what he was doing from after he gets back from the war. That'd be a good one to listen to. Maybe it's on our. Let me see, where do we put that? I think that's on our PowerPoint list. It's on Spotify. Country Boy, that's right. Let's hear Country Boy, a little of Dave mixing bebop and R&B.
Country boy running wild in this big old town. I'm a little country boy running wild in this big old town. Yes, all the girls love me 'cause they know what I'm putting down. Yes, they call me country 'cause I'm from a country town. But when I'm with my baby, I don't want a soul around. Yes, I'm from the country.
Yeah, we kind of got it there, I think, the Dave from 1952. And so, this is a classic theme in blues and jazz. Somebody comes off from the plantation world, comes to the big city, learns how to be cool, learns new things. And in a way, I mean, there's a little tongue-in-cheek here because this is 52. The arrangement's great. It's got the basic sort of jump jazz blues background. There's a little later, he's a big solo. But the point is that he comes back with this sense of assurance and ability to make a song like that, among others. But really, it was a couple years earlier, and maybe we can take a look at the photograph on PowerPoint where we see Dave with Fats, I think. Let's see what we find there. Well, there he is with his trumpet.
There it is.
Yeah, and then to the right, you see him. That's at Cosimo Matazza's studio, where he's working with Fats. And Fats Domino, who also comes from that same area upriver and was Creole speaking. I got to interview him once and hung out a little with him, and his Creole was pretty fluent, actually, into his 80s. But basically, they were a good pair in that Dave had picked up all this discipline in the army of arranging and scoring. And Fats was a sort of much more of a, smile, play beautifully, singing that great New Orleans accent. And he was the entertainer, where Dave was the sort of the man who managed everything. And together they end up selling arguably 75 million or more records between 1949 and 1963. And the first one, it would be worth listening to, I think, going back down to the Spotify list, would be The Fat Man, which is a New Orleans beat tune called the Junkers Blues that turns into a song about Fats Domino, the Fat Man, a name given to him by Dave. Classic New Orleans piano to Fats Domino.
They call me the Batman, 'cause I went to
Fats, produced by Dave, and that last line is about how he literally in New Orleans, standing on the corner of Rampart and Canal, looking at the Creole girls. And notice that both of these songs do go back to love, romantic love, which of course is something in the military is always the question is, where is my significant other? Will I see her, him again? How is it going to go? And so, any of this kind of music fits the general interest in love, love's found and lost, which is all over our popular music. But to really get a feeling for what Dave was able to do, I think we ought to go back up to the PowerPoint if we could. And that audio clip I think we've got with his picture, this is Cosimo Matassa talking about Dave's great abilities in the studio.
If there hadn't been a Dave Bartholomew, there may not have been a Fats Domino. Everything was precise. Everything was rehearsed. Everybody better damn sure wear the same shirt, tie, and suit. Dave was the disciplinarian. Dave kept everybody knowing we're here to make a record. I know we're all having a good time, but we're here to make records. And Dave was great about that.
And I should point out that, in that studio on Rampart Street, J&M Music, which is now, I think, a washateria with an historic plaque in it, made all those records with Fats. And then Little Richard, it's arguably who just passed away. Little Richard really got the New Orleans beat, the backbeat put in, and Dave really helped Little Richard, really get a sound that they thought he needed to succeed. Lloyd Price, good, Lordy, Lordy, Miss Claudie, and many others. So on his passing, I think Bartholomew is known as kind of an architect of rock and roll. But, where does this ability to transform music, to play both bebop, we don't have a lot of recordings of him, but make all these records and arrange them, manage the bands, it does seem to come from his military experience. And so that's really a happy story, it seems to me, of somebody gaining something. A great town, sharing it during World War II, but also bringing it home to the home front and building on it.
I wanted just to sort of throw in a couple of things, Nick. That was fantastic. These images are great, and just hearing Dave Bartholomew and hearing the Fat Man again. Those are just all-time classics. My father, that's how I first learned about Fats Domino. He's a huge fan, still is a huge fan. And he talked about how that when he was a kid and he would go to, they would go out to have a few beers and put some money in the jukebox. And there would always be like a new Fats Domino single out from the last time they were there. Like he and Dave Bartholomew were just cranking them out, and so that there was this stream of incredible work. And so you were never really kind of ahead of the curve with Fats and Dave Bartholomew. They were always putting out new music in the mid-late 50s, early 60s, and that body of work just stands on its own. And the other thing I thought I would just mention too is that, speaking of the New Orleans connection, what I read about Dave Bartholomew, including from my colleague Rebecca, again mentioning her article on him, is the way he looked up to Louis Armstrong, mm-hmm. and what Louis meant to him as a young trumpeter.
Right.
Right. And like that Louis was somebody who came from obviously not exactly an affluent background, and what he accomplished. And so for someone like Dave Bartholomew, Louis was this towering figure, a real inspiration for musicians in New Orleans, even though he obviously went in his own direction, right? Dave did as one of the kind of founders of rock and roll. Louis and the kind of New Orleans jazz history was still very much there for him all along.
Yeah, in New Orleans, we've continually had the current of New Orleans traditional jazz with popularization, moving towards rhythm and blues and rock and roll, and they're out there now today. And Bartholomew comes more out of the Afro-Creole world, and Armstrong, African American, and the waif, raised partly by the Karnofskis, the Jewish folks that ran a junk dealership and other things. But ultimately, a lot of this African American music kind of unites Creoles with African Americans, and it becomes a larger scene together. And again, back to the globalism of the military allows people to kind of mix and mingle and learn new things.
Well, that's great. I think, maybe we should think about a contrast to Dave Bartholomew, a very different figure who served in the U.S. military and went in his own direction too after the war, and that's Marshall Allen. And I have to say, Nick, you were a person who made me more aware of him than I had been before. But what should we know about Marshall Allen, kind of as a very different figure from Dave Bartholomew?
Great. Well, we can see the image of him there, and he's on his saxophone, and it looks like a jam session at a festival from the 60s at some point. Marshall Allen is 95 now. He served for, I believe, 4 years in World War II. He purposefully joined the Buffalo Soldiers because of that whole association with black federal troops and the honor involved in that. After the war, he stayed in Paris for a while and took training at the conservatory and then came back and forth a few times. But Marshall Allen is sort of best known to the people in the jazz world as the sort of second in command of Sun Ra's Intergalactic Orchestra. Now, Sun Ra is not exactly a household word, but in the jazz circles, he really is the leader of the free jazz movement from the 50s, 60s on. He's from Birmingham, Alabama. He was so alienated in his childhood, despite the ministrations of a religious family, that he took to calling himself Sun Ra from Saturn rather than Sonny Blount, which was his real name. And by the time he gets to Chicago, he just becomes Sun Ra. And Sun Ra is very much an avant-garde modernist. And so here's Marshall Allen in the military playing, on site, on base, and what have you. And here, by the time he comes back, he meets Sun Ra in the late 50s. And Sun Ra died, I guess Sun Ra died in about 72 or 3 now. And so basically Marshall Allen took over. And they moved to Germantown, Philadelphia, away from New York and Chicago, to a small suburban community, African-American community, where they became these Afrofuturists with all the sense of history and literature, but projecting a future. And to them, free jazz was a future statement about freedom, about improvisation. And the key theme song, which we should listen to now, I suppose, is on Spotify, is Space is the Place.
Space is the place. Space is the place. Space is the place. Yeah, space is the place.
I think you get the idea. This is music that determines place will be, what you make of it, and you create that space. But in his army discipline, he ends up being the chief cook, the manager of the house, the guy that handles who rooms and lives where in the house, which is still active in Philadelphia. And, he handles an eccentric personality who was kind of, demanding quite a bit of people to be no drinking, no women, play the music, 12 hours a day practice, and everybody's going to eat moon stew. So, in a funny way, Space is the Place. So when it started, it almost does sound like some kind of medieval band, being led down the road.
Right. I mean, it does have that. There's a sense, on the one hand, it looks like it's really free and open, and yet this whole band project, as you point out, is very disciplined. It's very regimented. There is clearly an order to it and a commitment to it that's really required, and maybe that really does have some roots in the military service from the war. And I guess I wondered, Nick, if there's a sense here with Sun Ra and Marshall Allen of reclaiming something about the improvisational character, or maybe that's not the right word, but the more kind of free-spirited side of jazz prior to this commercialization. Do you see that really happening with them after the war, this kind of I mean, it is. It's very futuristic. It's very, it's very imaginative.
It's 1950s, 60s futuristic, which makes it even more fun. Well, I mean, I think, New Orleans still has jazz as a community music. I mean, we've got second lines all the time with brass bands continuing in the neighborhoods, and for Mother's Day or a Saints Parade or a Social Aid and Pleasure Club. I think when jazz left New Orleans and went to Chicago and New York, it became more professionalized. Touring becomes big. Bebop, is a counter to a big commercialization. It's going to be about the freedom of that individual. But, with the Sun Ra direction, and I think the New Orleans direction, emphasizes the communal. That doesn't mean there aren't trombone shorties in the crowd who are brilliant, or Armstrong for that matter, way before him. But there is this interesting pulsation in jazz between the individual great player and the crowd following down the street, or playing, backup to the trumpet. Or whoever is the lead instrument. So there's a sense of that there. And I think the military is the same for these musicians. Dave Brubeck gets picked out not to go to the front precisely because he can play the piano so beautifully. Performance has a way of structuring life. And if you're really good, you get recognized and it changes how you operate as a professional vis-a-vis the music.
Yeah, that's a very good point. This is a communal kind of moment in jazz, and I think it's good for us to see that too. There are great players and great talents, but there's a sense of the collective with them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Project, not just in the music, but the whole way of life is really that. And speaking of, contrasts, Nick, we've had Dave Bartholomew, then Marshall Allen, very different from one another, even though passing through the same war. Lester Young.
Yes.
Now, here is a very different war experience. An incredibly talented musician, but a much unhappier story. And I need to make sure we include it in our discussion.
Well, I mean, Lester Young's from Woodville, Mississippi, not too far from here, across the Louisiana borders. His parents are from in Louisiana and the Florida parishes, musical people. He ends up coming to New Orleans, getting involved in music. And, he just grows and grows as a saxophone player. And, finally he's drafted. And he's drafted into the regular army. He's not drafted to play music, and that is a problem. And he's basically not allowed to have a saxophone or play any music. And people have described him. He wore a zoot suit. He kind of created his own language. He's very much a lot of the modernists of that era. Wear that little pork pie hat. You see him in there in the black hat. And he just wasn't a man cut out for military discipline. I always wonder if he had been recruited to play in a band in the military, if his life would have been different in the military. But unfortunately, he was using heroin, and he was caught on base doing that. And he was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. And all accounts are that it was extremely difficult for him psychologically. He actually did a blues called Detention-Based Blues after he got out that wasn't widely heard, but he put that experience into music. In the meantime, though, he grew and became known as Prez, the president. That's what Billie Holiday called him, and he played with Billie Holiday. And, his brilliance as a musician continued, but one senses that experience sort of being marginalized and the taunt of threats, racial threats while in the military, because he was, the weird guy with no band, basis to be there. It hurt him, and his career, went downhill little by little towards the end of the 50s, and he dies young. But we could listen to him when he's still a little vibrant after the war, playing a tune that we've got called Jumpin' with Symphony Sid on Spotify, Lester Young on tenor sax.
Thank you.
Lester Young. Jumping with Symphony Sid. Symphony Sid was a DJ at 52nd Street, and Lester did the theme song, so that the crowd in the background is like, opening for the show. And that's not super bebop to there. I mean, that's danceable. The improvs are fairly understated. And so, I mean, he knew an audience. He could play in a social context, but he never really had that chance to succeed in the military, and he just wasn't oriented in that direction. And so one of the great geniuses has a pretty sad experience, even though he continues, but in the end he ends up passing away young. And we all look back to his stuff with Billie Holiday and some of his great sort of pre and kind of bop stuff, and the fluidity and joy with which he played. And so it's sad to think about him, but happy to know that he finally kind of got moving again for a while after the war years.
Yeah, it's just a reminder that everyone's experience, I mean, there were very different experiences for people who served, and Lester Young's was not at all like lining up with the one that's typically remembered, but we should make sure we acknowledge it. And also note that he has this career before and after World War II that's really incredible. I mean, his playing is just so warm and beautiful. I mean, you just want to sit and listen to him play. And then when I think you learn about his story, Nick, his individual biography, there's so much turmoil and pain there, but it's not all there is to it. There's so much kind of affirmation, I think, that comes through in his playing, and the piece that you just shared with us really has that. But it's kind of watching our time here. We have a fourth person we should talk about. And so we've had 2 sax players and a trumpeter, right? Why don't we bring in a piano player for this fourth one? And you've already mentioned him, and that's Dave Brubeck.
Right.
And a story that he has a pretty remarkable World War II story all his own.
That's true. And he comes from California, an agrarian a family farm, and he thinks he's going to be a cowboy. But in the end, he ends up being this incredible classically trained jazz musician. And, there's his story intrigues me. I was reading about the 28th Infantry Division Band and in the Battle of the Bulge, how on some of these organization bands that went with particular units ended up, actually, near a front, carrying wounded and dead back, handling weapons. And so, so apparently that band in that period, would put away their instruments and dig foxholes and go out with guns and bazookas and fight. And in Battle of the Bulge, that was what was absolutely needed. And Brubeck hit a point where that was going to happen for him. And you know this story. I mean, you can tell it if you want. It's pretty fascinating.
It is pretty fascinating. Nick, you've already touched on a few key parts of it. I mean, he had qualified as a sharpshooter during his training in the U.S. Army, and he gets to France, lands on Omaha Beach about 3 months after D-Day, and makes his way to north central France. And he knows he's very close to going into combat as a really replacement soldier in Patton's Third Army. I mean, that's what he was going to be doing. And it's really kind of getting late summer, early fall of 44. And I think, Nick, probably either one of us could tell the story about the Red Cross girls that he encountered and this opportunity to play there that really changed his life. It really did. Changed his military service, and it changed his life. Do you want to tell that, or I mean, either one of us?
You tell. You're the man who's been researching it, and then we'll go back and maybe play a clip that shows what Brubeck takes from his war experience in terms of jazz as really at the center of American diplomacy by the late 50s.
Yeah, I'll make this quick so we can really get to the music. But he's with the 17th Replacement Depot, and he knows that he's going to ship out for the front very soon. And there's this group of women from the Red Cross are there, and the call is issued like, we need somebody to entertain. Is anybody here, can play piano? And Brubeck said he thought about it, and then he said, yeah, I can play. And so he stepped up there, and he did such an incredible job that the commanding officer, Colonel Brown, said, oh, this guy's staying. He's going to stay. And he pulled out two other guys and said, these 3 are staying, and they're going to form a band. And that, of course, became the basis for the famous Wolfpack band that Brubeck led in 44, 45.
Right.
And it was by chance, Nick. It was just this chance thing that happened, and he said it just changed his life. It did. It was absolutely
well,
right.
and I mean, and in a sense, that is the chaos of war. But he had that moment where he could stand up, and performance generated a very different relationship to the military than, say, Lester Young ever had. And of course, Brubeck, very thoughtful man, beautiful player. And I know he fully realized the great benefit that he had. And then he went on after the war to become part of touring with Louis Armstrong. And we have a wonderful clip of him describing going to Eurasia and Armstrong's involvement in cultural diplomacy with jazz. And so there's an impact that's different than, say, a Dave Bartholomew and the roots of rhythm and blues and rock and roll. This is about American foreign policy. Let's see, I believe that's on our PowerPoint.
President Eisenhower sent me out, but first Louis went out, and before Louis, Dizzy Gillespie.
The State Department has discovered jazz. It reaches folks like nothing ever has. Like when they feel that jazzy rhythm, they know we're really with them. That's what we call cultural exchange.
Eisenhower knew how important it was for us to start exchanging culture and ideas and everything. So he sent me first behind the Iron Curtain to Poland, then to Turkey, and then right along the border of Russia, we went to Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, East and West Pakistan, India. And that was one hardship tour, I'll tell you. It was tough, but it was important because we realize how important jazz is to the freedom that we're trying to establish in the world.
Dave Brubeck, of course, since passed away. What a great and generous and kind man he was. And his band was integrated, interestingly enough. There wasn't, that was not a commonplace. And so that was special. But his ability, I think, to work with all different kinds of people was part of it. And, of course, he and Armstrong are such a wonderfully different pair. And look at where he went, all the places in the world where America today, you just have to wonder if there are elders who heard some of the jazz tours and had at least some sympathy for America at its best, representing diversity and unity and creativity. You have to wonder how much of that filters down to people. But I'm a big believer in cultural diplomacy, and that, the World War II wouldn't happen without the high command, Eisenhower himself,
right,
realizing, hey, we got to do this.
And Brubeck, you pointed out, there's a real issue of principle there was for him. I mean, the Wolfpack band was integrated. He had the master of ceremonies for the shows was African American. He had a trombone player, Jonathan Flowers, who was an African American man who, and Brubeck was like, this is our band. I mean, this is our band. It was an integrated band. And he mentioned, that Colonel Brown, later General Brown, stood behind him on this, strongly supported him on this. And that was one of the reasons why they could do it at the time, is that he did have backing, but Brubeck did stand up for this and said, this is the way it's got to be. And of course, Nick, I think anybody who's ever studied Brubeck's post-war life knows that he was openly supportive of civil rights for African Americans from very early on, and refused to play shows at segregated venues in the American South and later in South Africa. So this was not something that just was a World War II phenomenon for him. It was lifelong. I mean, he was dedicated to civil rights and to democracy, and really thought, it came through in that clip you shared with us about freedom.
Yeah,
intrinsic about jazz and freedom that had to be thought through. So I think it's good that we keep that. We keep that in mind about Brubeck. It was a long post-war life that he enjoyed, and where he stuck by those ideas that you first see him show in his military service in the war.
Yeah, and he played Jazz Fest here in New Orleans a couple of years before his passing, and it's just just amazing to hear all that. And, he had two of his sons are great musicians too. So it's a family legacy that's continued. No one's going back to being a cowboy or a farmer, but he was certainly, in favor of all. I mean, he was very, very open to all people, classes, and cultures. And that I think is what makes him feel like a wonderful figure in the democracy and his war experience.
Great. So did you want to play any clips, anything else, Nick, from Dave Brubeck, or should we start taking some questions?
I think we're good for now. And if questions provoke interest in other things, we've got some other music and clips we can go to, but let's see what people are thinking about all this. I don't get, on the radio, no one ever sees me. So I'm on a tightrope here today, but let's hear what some of the folks who are following your gatherings.
We're already getting some questions in. So I'm going to start with my friend Gretchen, who is, thank you, Gretchen, for tuning in. And her question for Nick is that did any of the traveling USO shows invite soldiers like Dave Bartholomew or John Coltrane on stage to perform spontaneously? Like kind of spur of the moment.
Yeah. Well, and Coltrane, he was only in the military for a year. It was largely after the end of the war in Hawaii. He played in a segregated band called the Melody Masters. And so, the idea that a black person would get pulled out to play for people on a USO show, that just wasn't going to happen. As far as that would apply to Bartholomew too. I'm sure that in some of the events, people got up and certainly danced on stage, whether they were included. I have never heard that happening, but you know how music is. Once it gets going and there's a dance scene and, suddenly maybe there's USO performers, things can happen, but nothing monumental that I'm aware of.
Okay. No, that's interesting, kind of knowing about what were the limits of spontaneity, in this case with musical performances at the time. Interesting. So Joanne, she wants to know, if you had to identify a male and female singer who embodied the World War II experience, who would they be? Or who would you put forward for those, Nick? A male and a female singer for the World War II experience.
And they have to be singers. Well, I think the thing we always come back to, and it's very much the pop music of the era, but it's really great. I still love the Andrews Sisters, and it's almost cliche, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. I love Lena Horne on shows like Jubilee that were produced in Hollywood and sent over on these discs for people to hear from an African American perspective in jazz. There are also a lot of songs that were not jazz songs that were emblematic in country music. Elton Britt, there's a Star Spangled Banner waving somewhere. Old classic patriotic kind of pan. In a way, I think the thing about jazz is not all of it is vocal, and a lot of it is the voice is the saxophone, the voice is the melody and the mood. And one reason I do American Roots is so I get to play hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of artists and songs, and so I've not been one who settles on that's the one. I'm not that guy, and I think a lot of different people of that era have the one. Certainly Glenn Miller and that sound, In the Mood, American Patrol, a really interesting tune. I think those songs are like soundtracks for the era. Certainly In the Mood persists. American Patrol less known. So, I guess I'm failing to answer except to say Andrews Sisters. And there's a good shot at Glenn Miller. American Patrol is interesting to me because it used old patriotic songs from the 19th century, and he swung it. And, you could argue Glenn Miller his band was all white and a little scrubbed clean and a little perfect, but he did his duty and he organized well. But at the same time, the generals, the commanding officers were upset with him for turning Sousa marches into swing. So there was the other side of the line. You could say Glenn Miller is very much the straight mainstream performer who did that duty and was great at it. But on the other side of it, you see him pushing and saying, look, we're musicians. Let's swing this. This swing is what the kids want. The soldiers are the kids. This is the music they want. So you got to go inside the era, I think, to try and feel what would work the best for you. And any given song about loss and loneliness sung by Billie Holiday, I would have to think some of that would be really popular with some people in jazz. But again, I'll just defer to the individual listener to come up with their own.
It's a huge topic, and we could have a whole webinar just on that, like our kind of favorite singers from the era. Speaking of musicians that we haven't talked about, but Elisa asked, curious to hear your thoughts about Louis Prima and the role of jazz on the home front during the war, especially in New Orleans.
Well, I mean, in the same sense that jazz helped people, out on the front in the battle lines, reminds them of home, takes away loneliness. Maybe there's a dance or a show where they get to, have the play side of life, and their humanity is restored to them in that moment. Jazz back on the home front is very meaningful because, the crisis in America is not strictly out on the battlefront. It's the people who are back at home and the people who are missing their loved ones and, fearful of the future for them and for the country. And so jazz and familiar sounds play a role. And, Louis Prima, one of my absolute favorites, played on Bourbon Street a great deal. Louis Prima, loved by African Americans as well, never really made it as a rock and roller, didn't quite get into the New York jazz scene, came home to New Orleans and finally goes to Vegas in the late 50s and early 60s and becomes the sound of the Rat Pack. But there's no question that lots of musicians play back home for people, and some of it was explicitly about war messages and promotions, but a lot of it was just dancing and having a little party and, hanging out, which music allows people to come together. Here we are in the COVID moment, people are missing going to clubs and being in street parades and being at a concert, and everything's being done virtually, which, sure, we can listen to records and, dare I say, the radio, that's important. But in a city like New Orleans, where being together with people in the streets and clubs, I have to feel like Louis Prima's stuff would be really important.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to follow that up with, this is a question going back to Glenn Miller, since you'd shown the image, Nick, that would you describe Glenn Miller as the most famous of the World War II band leaders? Is he the person?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. They were recruiting for his band just like the NFL recruits players from colleges. They were going to get guys to have big bands and bunches of bands to go everywhere, and he was extremely good at it. And whatever one would say about, like, my dad was in World War II and he did not like Glenn Miller. He was a classical person, and he just said if he heard Elmer's tune one more time, he said I might shoot myself. But for the vast majority of people, Glenn Miller really was very, very powerful and popular. And maybe, do you mind if we listen to that little bit of Glenn Miller?
Absolutely not.
This is a track called on Spotify called American Patrol, and this isn't as well known as In the Mood, but I think it's really cool how it draws on Yankee Doodle, Dixie, Columbia, Gem of the Ocean. But this is a marches and military songs jazzed up. Feel-good music. It's feel-good music. It's predictable, but you get a smile when you hear military theme music jazzed up with a little bit of swing and bounce in it. And musically, they were just rock solid, and those arrangements were all just very precise. And so it's different than a lot of the black music where you have much more focus on the improvisation. But swing was meant for people to all the sections to all be coordinated, work together. Some people said that, the increase of mechanization in the Depression era, where everybody on the assembly line has to work together, that the swing is almost like an assembly line of music. But it's enormously comforting and familiar. And I would be smiling if I was hearing, these old military theme songs turned into essentially that kind of riffing. And it reminds you of both the social change, but also like, hey, that's where that started. So, but Glenn Miller's there. And of course, his mysterious disappearance over the English Channel in '44 adds to the aura of how, important he was. When somebody, goes to the war effort, he didn't need to be involved from what I've read. And then he ends up passing away, and we don't know how it happened.
Yeah, that's a terrific tune you played, Nick. And if you ever visit the National World War II Museum, you'll get, a serious exposure to Glenn Miller's music. I mean, this played all over the museum. We have lots of images up of him. I mean, he was such a towering figure in American pop culture at the time. And maybe that's a good place for us to close, Nick. It's almost noon here. And I want to thank you very much for a great conversation. I learned a lot from it, and I hope our viewers did as well. And they'll do some following up of their own and go check out Marshall Allen and Dave Bartholomew and Dave Brubeck and Lester Young and listen to a little more Glenn Miller. So thanks very much, Nick, for your time. This was a real pleasure.
Well, my pleasure is mine, and I appreciate all the good work that you're doing and all your team there and getting out information while the museum has to, close its doors. But I think you've opened it up online, and that's been brilliant. And I'd be unprofessional if I didn't say I hope people will tune into American Roots, ROUTES. You can find us online. We do topics like this all the time, and we enjoy doing it. And yes, I will soon be back at the World War II Museum and channeling Glenn Miller and looking at the photos and everything else that's really great that you do with culture and history that frames our understanding of World War II.
That's much appreciated, Nick. We look forward to seeing you there.